In wartime, now when we were drafting the Newport manual, there was some interesting fact which I was not cognizant of, which came to light, which is the US position on sinking an enemy merchant vessel premised on the fact that it is sustaining the war effort.
Is with such a high dependence on trade, if that instrument of trade is removed, or at least curtailed to your immediate periphery, and maybe just to Southeast Asia, etc., maybe a few land routes, then it can have a hugely detrimental effect, and internal ramifications with time certainly can build up. Morning, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Dabble Dialogues. Today, we talk about the applicability of international maritime law in the maritime domain. And as my guest, I have Captain Gurpreet Khurana, and no better person in the country than to discuss this issue. Captain Khurana is well known to all of you, but for the benefit of those who don't, let me briefly introduce him. He is a gunnery officer, and gunnery, in fact, is about violence. And here you're talking about, more about peace enforcement. He has commanded 2 ships in his younger years. He was instrumental in the framing of India's maritime doctrine, which came out in 2009. After that, he was the executive director of the National Maritime Foundation for 5 years. More recently, in 2023, he, with a group of 9 other authors, wrote out the Newport Manual on the Law of Naval Warfare, which was published by the Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island. And currently, he, along with a group of other experts, international committee of experts, is engaged in the review of the San Remo Manual on the laws of armed conflict at sea. So you can see he is an expert in the field. So to start with, Gurpreet, I thought, can you give us a broad overview on the hierarchy and the basic principles of of international maritime law and its broad structure?
Thank you, Admiral, for having me here in the Dabble Dialogues, which is increasingly gaining popularity, not only among the naval professionals, but also beyond that, to the policymakers and the populace, the general populace. And thanks for your kind words to introduce me. As you know, international law relevant to the maritime domain is of specific applicability to us because the Indo-Pacific region is a maritime configured region. Here, the hierarchy of law will be, of course, there will be peacetime laws and wartime laws. Peacetime laws are generally regulated through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the Umbrella Convention. And of course, there are many other treaty-based sources of law and customary law. And then we come to the wartime laws. Wartime laws it starts right from the top in terms of the justification for use of armed force against another country, which is regulated largely by the UN Charter, whether it is in terms of Article 51, which gives the right to self-defense to countries, which has been used and misused many times by countries. For instance, the latest, some of the examples right from the war in Iraq in 2003. And of course, there is also a provision in the UN Charter for collective action to preserve international security under the Article 42, Chapter 7. So this is what in Latin we call as jus ad bellum, which is the justification of a state to use armed force. Of course, once whether the use of armed force is legitimate or not, the laws of armed conflict regulate the conduct of hostilities, which we call generally as I said, laws of armed conflict, or it is also called international humanitarian law. And we can say a subset of the laws of armed conflict is the laws of naval warfare, which, as I started by saying, that it is very relevant to us since we are in a maritime region, and therefore any conflict, armed conflict in this region is going to have a preponderant naval dimension.
So, I mean, that's very interesting. But what we are seeing more and more today is that this black and white, clear demarcation between peacetime and outbreak of hostilities is becoming fuzzy. And more often than not, we are in a state of, a state in which people are often describing as not war, not peace. So, how does the current set of laws have is it applicable to this sort of a situation, or does it need to evolve based on what is happening today?
Yes, I think you're right. We are seeing a churn in this respect in terms of the clear division between war and peace. Of course, it also involves non-state actors, which we have now started calling as hybrid warfare. But keeping the non-state actors aside, even with these amongst the state actors, this is a subject which is quite neglected, sir. And possibly it is neglected because it is not new. It was there during the Cold War when there were military confrontations, peacetime confrontations between the superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union on the other side. And so when the Cold War ended, we stopped probably thinking about it. Now take in the Indian context, it's not something which we have not encountered. We have encountered such incidents with Pakistan. I mean, you take the case of Pakistan naval ship Babar banging against INS Godavari I think in 2011, and the downing of Atlantic is another example, and that has happened notwithstanding the fact that we have a confidence building mechanism agreement with them. And now that we have to be cognizant of the Chinese increasing naval footprint in the Indian Ocean, and we do not have even a CBM agreement with them. So I think this is an area which we must pay more attention to.
So actually, let me just follow up on this. Is that can we depend on the tenets of international law to ensure that these situations at sea are handled according to some sort of a protocol, or does there have to be a bilateral or a multilateral agreement like CUES, the Code for Unintended Encounters at Sea, to resolve such issues? I mean, is the ambit of international law adequate, or do we have to?
Yes, so that's a very valid question, sir, because international law is clearly ill-equipped to deal with peacetime confrontations at sea. And as I'm sure you are aware that the genesis of the UNCLOS and how it was negotiated, and all the military issues except very bare minimum ones were actually left out of the ambit of UNCLOS totally, because they were so sensitive and they were so contentious that had they been forced through, UNCLOS would not have seen the light of the day. So UNCLOS is ill-equipped itself, and you do have some conventions like the COLREX of 1972, which stands for Collision Regulation Convention. That is essentially for navigation, for collision avoidance and things like that. So the international law is ill-equipped even in terms of the promulgation of security zones. So all these security zones, safety zones, when we have a missile firing, for instance, or even ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, these are all have evolved out of custom and state practice, and there is an ambiguity, there is a divergence in amongst nations onto the specific aspects of these practices as well. So you're right, international law is very ill-equipped, and therefore we have to, you're right, the only way forward is to have bilateral agreements. Now the question remains is that will China be agreeable to have a bilateral agreement with India in the naval domain in the Indian Ocean, I'm not sure. I don't think so, because why should China constrain itself when its naval power is projected in the Indian Ocean? And coming to your what you hinted about the Qs, which is a multilateral agreement. Now, Qs is not for the Indian Ocean. It was essentially a part of the West Pacific Naval Symposium, and it operates only in the Western Pacific, and there too it excludes many of the forces, like the Chinese Coast Guard is excluded from that. So it's quite a, I would say, a toothless kind of arrangement. Something like that we could have in ions as well, for whatever it's worth. I think that should be the way forward for us. Thank you.
So, if I'm not mistaken, some discussion in ions has already taken place regarding adopting Qs in the Indian Ocean. And I'm not too sure whether a decision in this respect has already been concluded or not, but maybe we can discuss that a little later.
Yeah.
The other issue, now coming to a more regional context, of course, we have, CBMs with Pakistan. CBMs with China, as you're saying, they might be, in one way, you've mentioned reluctance of China, but there could be possibly even reluctance from our side, to engage in these sort of CBMs. In one way, it legitimizes their presence over here. If you engage in CBMs with them, so that means you're becoming, though by and by, I think that is going to happen anyway. And second would be, of course, on the contours and the extensive process of the discussions and what should it finally shape out to be. But are there any other creative solutions to make sure that in case, in the event of some degree of contestation in the Indian Ocean, you think bilateral separate approaches or multilateral or a combination of both? What should be our an overall path moving ahead to make sure that there is some semblance of order in case it comes down to a time of contestation, not war, but contestation at sea?
Yes, sir. As you mentioned, this ions thing, under the ions, such a multilateral agreement had started, as you said. I do not think it has seen the light of the day, but I think that is the only way when some kind of a order can be established, and that can be used as a leverage against any extra regional naval power, such as the Chinese Navy. I think that is the only way out. Otherwise, to have to desire to have new conventions, even regional conventions, it's very difficult for countries to agree, as we have seen in the UNCLOS negotiations.
So now let's switch to the Western Pacific. So another hot issue brewing over there is, of course, Taiwan, and there are issues regarding all sorts of things, of cables being cut and encircling movements by PLA ships, etc. US position in this has been ambiguous so far. There have been, while I think President Biden had made certain comments saying that they will come to the assistance of Taiwan in case there's an overt attempt by China to take over the island. But the US State Department, I think, backtracked from that position and saying and preferred to continue with the position of ambiguity. Now we have a new administration in place where everything is still up in the air, and until the dust settles, maybe a clearer position will emerge. But the US also is cognizant of the rise of Chinese maritime power, the dramatic increase in the rise of Chinese maritime power. And we've discussed this in the past, of the astronomical rate of construction of destroyers, frigates, and all sorts of capabilities that they're building up over there. And I think it would be fair to say that the balance of power over there is shifting. And we can probably soon reach a tipping point, if you've not crossed it already, where it might be an operation, overt operation by the US, in the defense of Taiwan might be hazardous to some extent at least. They might succeed or may not, but it will certainly be at great cost. So I had recently written an article on this in the proceedings, where I've said my articulation has been that why should the US constrain themselves in terms of time or in terms of geography? Because Taiwan is only 100 nautical miles from the Chinese mainland, but at enormous distances from even Guam and on mainland US, of course, is several thousand miles, or Hawaii. So the articulation essentially is, if it is made clear to China that even though their power is growing, but their power, I mean, so far, Chinese naval influence beyond the second island chain. Up to the first island chain, it is strong, slightly weaker till the second island chain, but beyond that, I would say it is still relatively weak in the absence of bases, etc. If you use trade as a threat, China, as we know, is the largest trading nation in the world. Trade to GDP ratio around 37-38%, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in that region. $6 trillion worth of trade is what China does. A large part of that is using the sea as a medium for its transfer from one place to the other. If the articulation of the US is that even if Taiwan were to fall, the situation does not stop over there. Chinese flagged vessels, wherever they are globally, let's say, Chinese flagged, and you can extend that to Hong Kong flagged, and you can probably even extend that to Chinese owned in case they are, flagged in flags of convenience, etc. That they will be impounded and they will not be allowed to ply wherever they are. So this would be a massive disruption on a scale that would have, huge, I would say, internal consequences for a country like China, whose dependence on the seas for the transfer of its goods is enormous. So if the threat of this disruption is used as a means of deterrence, I thought from a legalistic point of view, in terms of international maritime law, is this viable, and can it be contested?
Yes, that's a very novel thought. I think it's quite valid. Uh, I would actually. I think I read your article in which you have cited Friedman, who has said that after the World War II, and I would say more so after the Cold War, the U.S. ships, U.S. Navy is everywhere, and it has the power uh, to uh, to search, to stop, and to sink ships as at will. I think that's a very relevant point that you have made in your paper, and I would uh, expand this argument further to say that maybe even before Taiwan falls, or maybe even after, could it be a phase two of US president uh, pressurizing China in terms of tariffs uh, to deter China from taking Taiwan in the first place? Uh, and as far as the legal thing is concerned, so it is either peacetime or it is wartime. So in the peacetime, certainly the Chinese ships or Chinese flag vessels, that is, or Chinese owned, which are flagged by the flags of convenience states, that can certainly be harassed during peacetime, uh, premised on various kinds of premises like law enforcement. And to give you a snapshot of what the Americans did, sir, you would recall in 2004, after 9/11 attacks, the US had launched the Proliferation Security Initiative, and it started boarding ships at will. Of course, there was a lot of protest from the international community, and thereafter, the US signed bilateral agreements with the flags of convenience countries, which give their flags registries, like Panama, Liberia, and all that. And the terms of those agreements were such that if you do not give us permission to board your ship, within 4 hours we will board it. And so this is some kind of a precedent which already has been set. So this is peacetime. In wartime, now, when we were drafting the Newport manual, there was some interesting fact which I was not cognizant of, which came to light, which is the US position on sinking an enemy merchant vessel premised on the fact that it is sustaining the war effort. Clearly, the international law of armed conflict says that if uh, your merchant ship, which is a civilian object, is helping the war effort directly, then it becomes a military objective, and therefore you can. But it does not actually go further than that to say even if it's sustaining the war. I mean, which means even if you are exporting your goods, you will be getting money out of it, and that money will go indirectly into a war effort. So this is the US position which is taken, which is very surprising, because it is unlike the position which its allies in Europe have taken. And even it is even more surprising that actually it is in India's favor. If India was to be a belligerent or fight a war against China, as I think you have written in your article, that unrestricted submarine warfare is not something which we can expect today, which I totally agree with. But using submarines to sink merchant vessels, for instance, Indian submarine sinking Chinese flagged merchant vessels is certainly within the realm of possibility, in my view. Because otherwise submarines lose their relevance, because the submarines will not be waiting only for PLA Navy ships to sink.
Yeah, but I don't think it will come down to that, because if you have such a vast number of Chinese vessels which are engaged in international trade, and it is impossible for all of them to be defended. Even though the Chinese Navy might grow to a 400, 500 ship navy, wherever they go, in case there is, if parties are already engaged in combat, firstly, you cannot distribute them too thinly all over, because they become vulnerable themselves. So, in a sense, merchant ships, most merchant ships, I would say, you need not get down to a point where you have to adopt kinetic means. I mean, today you find merchant ships, even when confronted by Houthis with a skiff and a small, handgun, no merchant naval officer signs up to get into a firefight, really. The default position for them is to lock themselves up in a strong room until some sort of help arrives, if it does not. If these vessels, wherever they are, they can be detained in harbors, they can be stopped at sea wherever they are. In case they resist, then certainly I think a calibrated amount of force, in the sense that you can use a gun to firing after warning shots. If you fire a couple of rounds, if even that doesn't work, into the engine room or some such place, most engine rooms are unmanned, the shell will ricochet around, something will break, the ship will stop. So in that way, I would feel. But so I say this more, as you rightly pointed out, from a point of deterrence, that if Chinese dependence on trade is existential, then this is certainly an instrument that can be used in a war where the concept of blockade, or you take it to a global scale. I mean, you don't limit it to a particular confined area. You take it to a global scale, so that then becomes very difficult for anyone to sort of operate in this sort of a manner.
Yes, sir. I think I fully agree with you that we may not be pushed to go that far as to
Yeah.
start sinking the Chinese merchant vessels. But as you said, that it's a deterrent, and deterrent can only be credible if you have options which maximizing
Yeah.
through which you can cause maximum effect. And in among the various options that you have, this is one of the options which we should not disregard.
Yeah.
And also this also, because this will create some kind of a psychosis in China. It will be a very symbolic kind of a option that we would have. Even though, as you said, that China has so many merchant vessels, it also have much of strategic reserve, for instance, oil and all. But if you, by whatever means, of course, there is also an issue that if you start seizing Chinese merchant vessels on whatever grounds, that it becomes a liability burden on you, for you to escort it to your port and things like that. Is one more angle to it. And so anyway, in whatever way you sort of interdict the Chinese vessels, whether you sink it or seize it, it could lead to a psychological effect in China, maybe some kind of a virtual energy crisis, if not a real one, stock market collapse and things like that, which will be a great, which will have a great impact on the outcome of war.
Yeah. So I agree that the internal ramifications can be huge, because in a country in which essentially you have signed which has engaged in some sort of a grand bargain with their own population, which guarantees them year-on-year improvement in their lifestyles, in their in the way they sort of live their lives, provided they don't get involved in the political process in the country. Then, if you cannot deliver on that, even though nationalism might run high in instances like this, but after some time it begins to hurt. And if you're talking about, as I mentioned, is with such a high dependence on trade, if that instrument of trade is removed, at least curtailed to your immediate periphery, and maybe just to Southeast Asia, etc., maybe a few land routes, then it can have a hugely detrimental effect, and internal ramifications with time certainly can build up. So this, I think, is when we look at a Taiwan sort of situation, I write in that context. I think for the US, this is an instrument that can be, if articulated repeatedly, can be used as an instrument of deterrence. That it's not just about Taiwan. This goes beyond that. If Taiwan even falls, it's not, nothing stops there. It's not that the conflict stops, but this is going to be persistent and going to last a long time and going to have huge economic ramifications for China. So I just thought I'd mention that. But I'm glad to see that from a legalistic standpoint, you feel that it is very it is really
Yes,
doable.
certainly.
So from India's now coming, I think we're running short of time as well. So what suggestions would you have, moving ahead for India? How should we move ahead in our in trying to shape the various aspects of international maritime law that will be advantageous to us in preservation of our interests?
Yes. So, in the Indian context, I think if and when a maritime conflict breaks out in the Indo-Pacific, India will need to decide based on various factors which will be present at that time whether it would like to be a neutral or it would like to join the war as a belligerent formally. One thing is certain that India would not follow the Western concept of qualified neutrality, like for the Europeans and the Americans had been doing in the Ukraine war. Of course, having said that, even if India maintains neutrality, there are many actions that India could take in terms of, sharing intelligence and all, which is not very obvious, and it is deniable as well. As far as shaping the law, actually, it's very difficult to enter into new conventions and sources of law. Whatever has been there, we are trying to write down the restatements of those customary law and the Hague and the Geneva conventions thereafter, and try to make sense of it and try to garner some kind of a solidarity amongst our like-minded partners. This Newport manual, so that you had mentioned earlier, was an effort in that direction, and significantly, India had stakes in contributing to the Newport manual, which I eventually went there, because it was a collation of all legal experts, although it acting in their personal capacity and not in official capacity, from all the Quad countries plus the UK and Germany. And so the sense that I got was that the effort was directed at having a common legal doctrine,
Okay.
so that in case there is a adversity in the Indo-Pacific, we should not start running at that time and searching for some kind of a common legal doctrine.
So is it, if I could interject, is it arriving at a common interpretation of existing
Exactly,
law?
exactly.
Okay.
That is because as I said, it's very difficult to start making a law,
Yeah.
because it takes a long time for the law to evolve from customary law and state practice. And so I think that's a good thing in that direction. And now that we are going in for the revision of the San Remo manual, a lot of issues which are now there in the Newport manual will willy-nilly go into the revised San Remo manual. And one of the things, as I said, that of course there are divergences between India and US in terms of interpretation of law of naval warfare. One thing which is common and which is, I think, quite interesting and very encouraging is the concept of war sustaining debate, which of course it may not come to that, but that is just an option that India and the US see
On the same
things
page.
on the same page. That's right.
And if I could again interject and ask you that what is the legal status of the San Remo manual?
Okay, yes, sir. So either it is San Remo manual or Newport manual or any kind of manual like the Tanel manual for cyber operations, these are not sources of law. They are not authoritative official sources of law. They are only restatements of the law. The official sources of law are only the treaties which are written, of course, and formally accepted by nations, such as the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the Hague Conventions of early 20th century, which also have become customary law. Even Geneva Conventions have now become customary law, or they are custom. So those are the. Now it is very difficult for you to interpret those treaties because they were treaties made for that past era, and therefore we need restatements of law. Now, having said that, I must also say that, for instance, San Remo manual and now the Tanel manual or the HPCR manual for air and missile warfare. So San Remo manual has garnered some kind of a not an official kind of a recognition, but because it is being used by navies all over the world, almost all over the world, it gets some kind of a legitimacy. So Newport manual, of course, is very new, so it just come out. So that is the difference, which is something which I'm glad you asked me this question, because many of even our naval officers had begun to believe that San Remo manual is an official document, and therefore why should we look at the Newport manual? All these documents are restatements, and the more the better it is, because that gives some kind of a variety of views for you to, because law is not objective.
So if it came down, let's say, to a hypothetical sort of trial in some sort of an international body, in ITLOS or whatever it is, or some a tribunal on armed conflict, can these documents sort of be quoted and can they be applied?
Yes, no, they cannot be.
Okay.
That is exactly what I was trying to, and I'm glad you clarified. This is now very well clarified. So the courts will go as per the judicial decisions of the past. They will go by these ones, because these ones are written by, as I said, by experts in their individual capacity.
Right.
So they are not ratified by the governments, and therefore they cannot be used.
So I think we should draw the discussion to a closure right now. So it remains for me to thank you once again for participating. It's been a hugely interesting discussion, and a lot of cobwebs, I think, cleared. So thank you once again. Gurpreet is a fellow, a resident here in Goa, so I'm sure we'll tap your expertise again from time to time in the dialogues.
Yes, sir.
Thanks once again, and thank you all viewers for sort of tuning in and listening into this conversation. Good
Thank
luck
you,
and
sir.
God bless.
Thank you, sir.